Hiking has always been how I find calm. I love the quiet of the woods, the sound of my boots crushing the leaves on the ground, and the feeling of being all alone with nature. So when I got the chance to try out a new trail deep in the mountains, I didn't hesitate. The map showed a path that wound through a thick forest before going up to a rocky peak with views stretching for miles. It was a bit farther and more isolated than my usual hikes, but that only made it more exciting. The first few hours were calm. The trail was narrow and covered with overgrown plants, but it was clear others had used it before. The trees were tall, blocking most of the sunlight, so the forest floor was always in shadow. The only sounds were my footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It felt like I was walking in my own world. But as the day went on, that feeling of being alone started to change. It was small at first, just a slight unease that made me glance over my shoulder more often than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept telling myself it was all in my head, but the feeling only got stronger the deeper I went into the woods. By late afternoon, I reached the part where the trail started to go uphill. The trees thinned out, and the ground got rocky. I was glad to be out of the thick forest, but the unease didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I could see farther now, but the area felt more empty, more lifeless. The shadows were longer, the silence heavier. About halfway up the hill, I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been clear enough until now, just disappeared. I stood there, trying to figure out where it went, but there was nothing. No sign of a path, no markings, nothing. Just rocks and scraggly bushes. I pulled out my map, but it was useless. The trail should have been right in front of me. I thought about going back, but the idea of retracing my steps through that forest with the growing feeling of being watched wasn't appealing. I decided to keep going, hoping to find the trail further ahead. I figured I could make it to the peak and find the loop on the other side. But as I kept moving forward, it became clear I was off the path. The ground was getting rougher, the rocks sharper, and the climb steeper. My legs burned from the effort, and my heart was racing, not just from pushing myself, but from the growing fear that I was lost. The sun was starting to set now, turning everything a dull, orange color. I knew I didn't have much time before it got dark, and the thought of being stuck out here overnight made my panic spike. I forced myself to keep moving, looking around for any sign of the trail, any clue that I was going the right way. But there was nothing. Just endless rocks and shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. I tried to stay calm, but the panic was building up, threatening to take over. I could feel the sweat running down my back, the cold air biting my lungs as I pushed myself harder, faster. Then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of my sight, half hidden in the shadows. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was too far to see clearly, but I could tell it wasn't an animal. It was a person, standing still, watching me. I stared, waiting for them to move, but they just stood there, not moving. The panic hit me full force then, and I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care about finding the trail. I just needed to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. I collapsed behind a large rock, gasping for breath, too scared to look back, too scared to move. The forest was silent around me, the shadows growing longer as the last light of day faded. When I finally forced myself to look, the figure was gone. But the fear wasn't. I knew I couldn't stay there, but the thought of moving, of running into whatever that was terrifying. I felt trapped, alone, and completely helpless. I waited until it was almost completely dark before I forced myself to move. I had no idea where I was going, but I had to keep moving. Every step was a struggle, every shadow a possible threat. My mind was racing, imagining all the things that could be out there, watching, waiting. By the time I found the trail again, it was fully dark. I had no idea how I found it, but I didn't question it. I just followed it, my legs shaking, my heart pounding. The trees closed in around me again, the shadows swallowing me whole. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glow of my car's headlights in the distance. I practically fell into the driver's seat, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I didn't look back as I sped away, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the trees blurring past. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I let myself breathe. But the fear didn't leave. Even now, I can still feel it, that sense of being watched, of being followed. The woods aren't a place of peace anymore. They're a place where something watches, something that shouldn't be there. And I can't shake the feeling that it knows where I am. It knows, and it's waiting. I set out early for a hike, excited for a quiet day in the woods. The weather was great, clear skies and a soft breeze. The path was easy to follow, and I thought it would be a simple hike. As I went deeper into the forest, I lost track of time. The trees grew denser, their branches blocking the sunlight and creating spooky shadows on the trail. I stopped to drink some water and noticed it was unusually quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just a creepy silence. As I continued, I saw something strange. The trail markers seemed to be changing. Where there had been bright orange tape, there was nothing now. I began to notice unfamiliar marks scratched into the trees. I tried to ignore it and kept going, but the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The sun started setting, making long shadows on the trail. I quickened my pace, hoping to get back to the start before it got dark. But the path seemed different now. It twisted more, and the landmarks I had seen earlier were gone. I started to panic when I realized I was lost. My phone had no signal, and the fading light made it hard to see. I tried to follow the trail that I thought would lead me back, but it seemed to turn and twist, almost as if it was trying to lead me astray. Night fell quickly, and the forest was swallowed by darkness. My flashlight barely cut through the black. It was getting cold, and I kept walking, hoping for a sign of the trailhead or any kind of help. The silence was overwhelming, and every little noise made me jump. Hours went by, and I was getting exhausted. I found a small clearing with a pile of rocks in the middle. Worn out and disoriented, I decided to rest there, hoping someone would find me soon. I fell asleep briefly, only to wake up suddenly when I heard a noise nearby. My flashlight flickered, and I saw a shadowy figure moving between the trees. My heart raced as I tried to call out, but the figure vanished into the darkness. Desperate and frightened, I fought to stay awake, but sleep overcame me again. When I woke, dawn was just starting to break. I followed the clearing to a narrow path I hadn't noticed before. It led me to a small, rundown cabin. Relieved, I went up to the cabin, hoping to find some help or a phone. The door was slightly open, and inside, the cabin was covered in dust and cobwebs. It had clearly been abandoned for years. It was a shelter, so I decided to wait there until someone found me. Hours later, a search party finally arrived. They had been looking for me all night and took me back to safety. The whole ordeal was over, but the feeling of being lost in that forest, the strange marks, and the shadowy figure haunted me. Later, I learned that the area where I had hiked was known for people getting disoriented, likely because of old, unmarked trails and natural obstacles. The woods can be treacherous, hiding dangers that can make even the simplest hike turn into a nightmare. I've never forgotten that night. Every time I think about it, I get chills. It's not just the fear of getting lost but the thought of something, or someone, watching me in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. The forest is unforgiving, and sometimes, it seems to have a mind of its own, hiding threats that can turn a hike into a real horror story. I've always loved hiking alone. The quiet, the peace, and the feeling of being far away from everyday life, it's what I needed. So when I got a free weekend, I decided to try out a trail I hadn't been on before. It was a little off the main path, but that made it even better for me. The trail started off fine, winding through a thick forest. The trees were tall and packed closely together, their branches forming a roof that blocked out most of the sunlight. It was darker than I expected, but I told myself it was just because of the thick leaves. As I kept walking, the trail became harder to see, almost like no one had been on it in a long time. I had to keep my eyes down to avoid tripping over roots and rocks. After an hour or so, I noticed the forest getting quieter. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves seemed to disappear, replaced by an eerie stillness. My footsteps sounded loud, too loud, in the silence. I tried to brush off the feeling, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the further I walked, the more uneasy I felt. The trail suddenly split into two, with no signs to tell me which way to go. I hesitated, looking down both paths. They were both overgrown and didn't look like they were used often. I chose the one on the left, figuring I could always turn back if it didn't seem right. As I walked, I realized the path was leading me downhill, deeper into the forest. The trees got even thicker here, and I had to push branches out of the way to keep moving. The air felt heavier, more humid, and it was getting harder to breathe. That uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. I checked my phone, hoping to see the time or my location, but I had no signal. The battery was low, too. I hadn't expected to lose service, but I wasn't worried yet. I'd been on plenty of hikes before and knew how to find my way back. Another hour passed, and I hadn't seen any signs of other hikers or the trail opening up. The path was almost impossible to follow now, with the ground covered in thick bushes. Panic started to rise inside me. I didn't want to admit it, but I was lost. I decided to turn back, but the way I'd come from was now just as overgrown and confusing as the path ahead. I couldn't tell which direction I'd come from anymore. The light was fading, and the forest was getting darker. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to stay calm, telling myself to focus and find my way back. I walked for what felt like hours, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all seemed the same, and the trail, if it even was a trail anymore, was gone. The silence was so loud now, with only the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I knew I needed to find a way out before it got too dark, but every direction looked the same, just trees and shadows. As the last bit of daylight disappeared, I realized how serious my situation was. I was completely lost, alone, in the middle of a huge, silent forest. The fear that had been growing inside me all day finally took over. I wasn't sure if I'd ever find my way back. The thought of spending the night out there, with no idea where I was or how to get out, was terrifying. I kept moving, refusing to give in to the panic, but my body was tired, and my mind was racing. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, felt like something creeping up behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing, just more trees, more shadows. It felt like the forest was closing in on me, the darkness swallowing me whole. Finally, I stumbled upon a small open area. It wasn't much of a clearing, just a spot where the trees weren't as close together. I decided to stop there for the night. I had no tent, no supplies for an overnight stay, but I was too tired to keep going. I sat down, leaning my back against a tree, trying to keep my breathing steady. The darkness was complete now, the kind of dark that makes you feel like you're the only person left in the world. I couldn't see anything beyond a few feet in front of me. My phone was dead, and the silence pressed down on me, heavy and crushing. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, almost like footsteps, but too quiet to be sure. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen, holding my breath. There it was again, closer this time, but still too quiet to be sure. It could have been an animal, but it didn't sound like one. It sounded like someone, trying to move quietly, just out of sight. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just sat there, frozen, as the sound grew louder, closer, circling the clearing. I wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was surrounded by darkness, and whatever was out there knew the forest better than I did. All I could do was sit there, listening, waiting, hoping that whatever it was would pass by. But the sound didn't go away. It stayed, just beyond the edge of the clearing, circling, watching. I could feel eyes on me, feel someone's gaze, even though I couldn't see anything. The fear was like a tight grip, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting for something to happen, but eventually the footsteps stopped. The forest was silent again, but the fear didn't leave. It hung in the air, thick and heavy. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, staring into the darkness, waiting for the sun to rise, praying that I'd survive until morning. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I got up, my body stiff and aching from sitting in the same position all night. The clearing looked different in the daylight, less threatening, but I knew better than to let my guard down. I had to find my way out, and fast. I started walking again, choosing a direction at random, hoping it would lead me back to the trail. The fear from the night before was still with me, pushing me forward, but the forest felt different in the daylight. It was still quiet, still unsettling, but the feeling of being watched was gone. After what felt like hours, I finally stumbled onto a familiar part of the trail. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I knew I wasn't safe yet. I followed the trail back the way I'd come, moving as quickly as I could without running. My mind was racing, replaying the events of the night, trying to make sense of what had happened. When I finally reached my car, I didn't waste any time. I got in, started the engine, and drove away, not looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main road, that I allowed myself to breathe, to let go of the fear that had gripped me since I first got lost. But even now, as I write this, I can't shake the feeling that something was out there that night. Something followed me, watched me. And though I don't know what it was, I can still feel its presence, like it's still with me, waiting. I'll never go hiking alone again, but deep down, I know that whatever was out there isn't done with me yet. It's out there, in the dark, waiting for me to return. I set out for a hike in a dense forest I'd never been to before. The trail had looked promising, and the early morning sun made everything look inviting. The forest was quiet, except for the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional call of a distant bird. The path wound deeper into the trees, and I enjoyed the peace and the fresh air. After a couple of hours, the trail became less clear, with fewer signs and more overgrown plants. I took out my map and compass, feeling reassured by the clear blue sky above. The sun was high when I noticed a narrow path splitting off from the main trail. It seemed to lead up a small hill, so I decided to check it out. The new path was steep and covered in loose stones, making each step a bit more difficult. I felt a slight unease, but I brushed it off, focusing on the beautiful view I expected at the top. As I climbed, the forest around me grew darker and denser, with the trees seeming to close in on me. At the top, the view was amazing, but I saw something strange. A few yards away, partly hidden by bushes, was a small, old cabin. It wasn't on my map, and it seemed out of place in such a remote area. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to take a closer look. The cabin looked abandoned, with its windows boarded up and the door hanging open. I approached carefully, my senses on edge. When I reached the doorway, I noticed a strong, unpleasant smell coming from inside. I peered in but saw nothing except darkness and old, rotting furniture. Just then, I heard a noise behind me, a twig snapping and what sounded like shuffling footsteps. My heart raced as I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. I looked around, feeling a cold sweat on my brow. The forest had become eerily quiet. Deciding it was best to leave, I hurried back down the trail, moving faster with each step. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone, or something, was following me. When I finally reached the main trail, I didn't stop to rest. I raced back to the parking lot, glancing over my shoulder constantly. The forest that had seemed so welcoming earlier now felt threatening and hostile. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been waiting in that cabin. I had wandered into a place I didn't belong, and I didn't want to think about what might have been hiding in those shadows. The forest behind me grew darker, and the strange encounter made me realize something chilling. It wasn't just a hike gone wrong, it felt like I had stumbled into a trap set by something that might still be watching me from the edge of the trees. The sense of unease stayed with me, and I knew I'd never forget the way the forest seemed to swallow up any trace of daylight, leaving me with an unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone and that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. The sun was setting when I decided to hike a new trail in the nearby mountains. I always loved finding new paths, getting away from the busy city life. The trail was new to me but well marked, winding through thick woods and over rocky hills. The air was cool and fresh, just right for a late afternoon hike. As I climbed higher, the path got narrower and rougher. Shadows grew longer, making the forest seem darker and more eerie. I kept moving, eager to reach the top before it got dark. I quickened my pace, driven by the sinking sun and the urge to see the view from the summit. I finally reached a clearing that gave me a breathtaking view of the valley below. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and for a moment, I lost track of time. The beauty was captivating. But as the last light faded, I knew I needed to head back. Getting down would be tricky in the dark. I turned to go back, but the trail looked different in the dim light. I couldn't find the path markers. My heart started to race as I wandered in what I hoped was the right direction. The forest, which had felt peaceful earlier, now felt oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made me jump. I told myself it was just the wind or small animals. As I continued, the ground got tougher. I slipped on loose rocks and had to grab tree branches to keep from falling. My legs were getting tired, and the cold night air was creeping through my clothes. I checked my phone for the time and saw the battery was almost dead. I needed to find my way back quickly. I stumbled upon an old, overgrown trail. It wasn't the one I had taken earlier, but it was better than wandering aimlessly. I followed it, hoping it would lead me back to the main path. The trees closed in around me, their branches scratching at my clothes. I pushed forward, trying to stay calm. Suddenly, I heard a low growl. My blood ran cold as I froze, listening closely. The growl came again, closer this time. I slowly turned and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. It was a large, wild animal, probably a mountain lion. My heart pounded as I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the predator. I remembered reading that making yourself look bigger could stop an attack. I raised my arms and yelled as loudly as I could. The mountain lion hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I ran, adrenaline pushing me through the forest. After what felt like hours, I burst out of the trees and onto a familiar trail. Relief washed over me as I recognized the path that would lead me back to the trailhead. I kept a fast pace, the encounter with the mountain lion fresh in my mind. The forest seemed less scary now, but I stayed alert, my senses on high. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed into the driver's seat, exhausted but thankful. I had made it out safely. But as I sat there catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. I looked back at the dark trail, and for a split second, I thought I saw those glowing eyes again, just beyond the trees. I quickly started the car and drove away, my heart still pounding. The drive home was tense. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those eyes following me. I knew it was unlikely, but the fear stayed with me. The mountains, beautiful and calm by day, had shown me a darker, more dangerous side by night. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I can hear a low growl outside my window, reminding me of that close encounter and the wild, untamed world that's always just a step away. I headed out early that morning, eager for a solo hike through the thick woods. The trail looked clear enough at first, but as the day went on, the trees seemed to crowd in closer, and the path became harder to see. I kept checking my map and compass, but the forest felt like a never-ending tangle of green. By midday, the sun was sinking lower, casting long shadows through the trees. I felt a knot in my stomach. I hadn't realized how fast the light would fade. I tried to head back, but the trail markers looked strange. Fear started to creep in, but I kept moving, hoping to find something familiar. As evening approached, I spotted something odd: tracks in the dirt. They were bigger than any animal tracks I'd seen, spaced out in a weird pattern. The tracks led away from the main trail. I was nervous but decided to follow them, hoping they might lead to a clearing or something. The tracks led me deeper into the forest. The trees grew taller and darker, making me feel uneasy, like someone was watching me. I kept looking around, but there was nothing there. My flashlight was on, cutting through the growing darkness. When the last light of day disappeared, I saw him. A figure stood still in the distance, mostly hidden by the trees. He wore an old, torn coat and a big hat that hid his face. I couldn't see his features, but the way he stood, completely still, was terrifying. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs felt like they were stuck in place. I tried to step back, remembering the way I'd come. The figure didn't move, but I felt an awful sense of danger. Panic set in. I turned and ran. My flashlight flickered, making the shadows twist and turn. I tripped over branches and thorns scratched my skin. My heart raced, and I didn't dare look back. Eventually, I burst out of the trees and saw the faint lights of a ranger station in the distance. I was exhausted and scared, and I sprinted toward it, bursting through the door. The rangers were shocked to see me, but they quickly helped me warm up and check for injuries. Later, when I felt safe enough to talk, one of the rangers told me about an old hunter who had disappeared in those woods years ago. They said he might still be out there, lost and dangerous. I don't know if it was him I saw, but the thought of that figure in the woods still haunts me. Even now, I sometimes hear strange noises when I'm alone, and I see that figure in my dreams. The forest was more than just trees and trails. It was a place where danger could come out of nowhere, and I learned that too late. The scariest part is knowing that whatever I saw might still be out there, waiting in the darkness. I'd always loved the quiet trails of Pine Ridge National Forest. It was a place where I could escape the noise of everyday life and just enjoy nature. That day, I decided to hike a less traveled path I'd heard about but never tried. It was supposed to be a short and easy trail, so I didn't think much of it. The first hour of the hike was normal. The sun was high, making shadows through the dense pine trees. The air was cool and fresh, and I felt at peace. But as I went deeper into the forest, the trail started to narrow, and the trees grew closer together, blocking out more light. About 2 hours in, I noticed something strange. The trail markers seemed to be gone. I stopped to check my map and realized I'd wandered off the main path. I was still calm, thinking it was just a minor detour. I turned around to find my way back, but the forest looked different. Everything seemed more tangled and unfamiliar. The sun began to set, and shadows grew longer. I moved faster, hoping to get back before it was completely dark. The forest now felt tight and suffocating. I could hear every crackle of leaves and distant animal sounds, but there were no familiar landmarks. As darkness approached, I saw something unsettling: fresh footprints in the dirt. They were large and seemed to be heading in the direction I had come from. My heart raced. I couldn't tell if they were from a person or an animal, but they definitely weren't mine. I tried to push aside the growing fear and focus on finding my way out. The light faded quickly, and I stumbled through the thick brush, each step feeling more desperate. The forest was now eerily silent. I could barely see the path ahead, and I felt hopeless. I remembered I had a whistle with me, so I blew it 3 times, hoping someone might hear. Then I saw a faint light through the trees. It was dim, but it seemed to be coming from a campsite. I followed the light and, after what felt like forever, I stumbled into a small clearing. There was a campfire burning, and a few people were gathered around it. They looked up, surprised to see me. I collapsed near the fire, exhausted and shaken. One of the campers gave me a drink, and I took it gratefully. They said they'd seen the trail markers for the less traveled path and decided to camp there because it was remote. They had heard some noises earlier but thought nothing of it. As I warmed up by the fire, I glanced back toward the dark forest. My mind raced with the thought of the footprints. Suddenly, I realized something chilling. The campfire light had not only shown me the campsite but also revealed fresh tracks around it, tracks that weren't there before. They were large, human-like, and they were coming closer to where we sat. The campers seemed oblivious, chatting among themselves. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The forest was still silent, but I knew I wasn't alone. Something or someone had followed me to the campsite. As the night deepened, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I promised myself never to venture off the beaten path again, and as I stared into the flickering fire, I couldn't help but wonder who, or what, had been out there with me.